Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk.Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Spencer Ford, creator of History for the Reckoning. It's a new podcast that uncovers overlooked and difficult chapters of history through intimate interviews with survivors, historians, and artists. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I get to be one of the most interesting podcasters. That's very exciting for me.
Today you do.
Hey, heck yeah. All right.
Okay, so I want to start with how you started this podcast, sort of your path that led you there. I know that it didn't start in a history classroom, but while you were co-writing a children's book series, is that right?
Yeah, so my wife and I were producing. I'm a podcaster through and through. We were co-writing a series of children's books that were called The Little Known Heroes. Get them wherever books are sold. And each book was about a little known hero from history, someone that we felt children would be able to learn from and learn some valuable moral lesson. And it was from usually underrepresented groups, so like Claudette Colvin, who was like Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks, civil rights leader, Dummy Hoy, who was a deaf baseball player, so there's like this ableist and overcoming adversity thing. But then I found Frank Emi. And Frank Emi was a man who was incarcerated during World War II in the concentration camps that the WWII had set up. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But his story was amazing because it was resistance, even though your entire community, not only the government, was against you, because the majority of the Japanese populace was feeling like we need to go along with what the government is saying. It's probably the safest thing for us, and perhaps they were right, that if we go along with what the government is saying, that we're just going to make it through this and it'll be horrible, but we'll make it. And he was like, no, they took away our constitutional rights. I'm going to stand up to this. And I just thought that was amazing. And I kind of became that was my area of history to look into. I was fascinated, maybe even obsessed, but for the next 5 years, I learned everything I could about the incarceration and everything that happened to the Japanese Americans, this incredible community. And since then, I've made friends within that community. I've gone to pilgrimages. I've built ties there, and just feeling like this is the biggest untold civil rights story in American history, in my view. So a podcast was a natural extension of that. My background in theater, music, kind of brought my areas of interest together so that I could share this with the world.
And so to pull on that a little bit more, I read somewhere that you also went to the sites of the camps. And I'm curious what that was like. I'm Polish. I've never been to the concentration camps in Poland, but I plan on doing that at some point.
Yeah.
But what did it feel like to stand on that ground, and how did that sort of change or inform the way you approached the making of this podcast?
Oh, what an interesting question. Sebastian, you're killing it. So I guess there's a couple of formative moments at these sites, because first off, I should tell people there were 10 of these large War Relocation Authority sites, held about 10,000 people each, and they're scattered around the United States. So there's probably one within driving distance of you. Might as well look it up. There's 2 in California, where a lot of the listeners might be. So the first one that I went to is in Topaz, Utah, which is central Utah. And that one I went as a student. So this was many years ago. I went there just because I'm a history guy, and this was a big piece of history. And doing that, I was really trying to put myself in the shoes of those who'd been there, trying to draw on empathy like anyone would. And as someone, your viewers wouldn't know this, but I'm in fact a Caucasian gentleman with mostly Irish descent. And so no familial connection to Japanese incarceration. So there is certainly a different feeling than someone who would have a family tie. So at that point, it was just, this was horrible. That's a very interesting piece of history. And you get the sense of scale and everything, the dust. But now, fast forward, some 10 years later, I went to Hard Mountain, which is in Wyoming, near Cody, Wyoming, as part of their pilgrimage. And a pilgrimage means that there are survivors and their descendants who come and congregate like a pilgrimage to a holy site in order to acknowledge what happened there, to heal from it, to talk about it. And when I went to that meant I was there in the context of the people who remembered it and the people who had been deeply affected by it. And I made friends with people who had been born there, who had been there when they were even as old as teenagers in the World War II. And that was a very different effect. Because particularly, there was a woman I met who had been born there, and we went on a tour as part of the site because the hospital building where she'd been born, still there. And so she got to see for the first time in her life the place that she'd been born, and hear the story of how her mother would have had to carry her across the camp, and just seeing the effect on her because her mother had told her none of these details. And so just seeing it through my friend's eyes was what made it suddenly incredibly impactful to me as an outsider. So maybe that's a message to everyone. Historical sites are beautiful things. You can learn so much, but my goodness, if you can make a friend with someone who's connected to it, if you are not, just night and day difference.
Yeah, that's incredible. Now, you decided to use the word reckoning in the title and the name of your podcast. And to me, reckoning implies it's not just about remembrance. It's a sort of accounting and a confrontation with that history and the consequences of what happened. I'm curious why you chose to use that word in particular. And maybe even further along those lines, what does it mean to you for America to reckon with this particular history?
Ooh, interesting question. Okay. So obviously it was a very deliberate choice to use that phrasing because everyone would have different and strong feelings about that word. But to me, it's a little bit different from the way that you've conveyed it. So it's very interesting to me that you and I have different takes on that word. Because to me, it implies understanding plus change. So like reckoning is I understood. So I think of it in the context of a really good apology. I have to understand what I did and I have to do some kind of change in the future, at least a commitment to do something differently. So for me, most of the stories that I'm going to cover as part of this podcast are bureaucratic, societal level problems. So things like, usually it's the rule of the majority versus the rule of the minority. In this case, the Japanese Americans were the minority and the majority chose to do something awful to them. And that's the case of so many terrible chapters in history, is like there were more people that chose to not care about the rights and needs of this smaller group and chose to hurt them. And we can make a choice every single day to vote in a way and to influence our politicians in a way that these things never happen again. That's step one, but that's not even the reckoning part. That is step one, -5, I guess, before we ever get to reckoning. But also we can understand that the patterns that we have set in place through this country's history and every country's history, frankly, are geared in a way that these things are possible and that we need to put measures in place so that when the next time this comes up, it is impossible to happen again. And that's based on an understanding of what has happened. So that's true of chattel slavery. It's true of the treatment of natives in the North American continent. And it's true of Japanese incarceration, that the things that allowed it to happen had been set up many years before it actually happened.
Now, you launched the show on February 19th. Like I said, it's a pretty new podcast, and that's the anniversary of Executive Order 9066. And I guess that was a deliberate choice as well.
Very much so, yeah.
What did it mean to you to be able to launch on that date? And do you think most Americans even know what happened on that day?
Not a chance. Do most Americans? Name any other executive order I've ever heard of. There's zero. So
sure.
Absolutely no
This is a pretty consequential one, though.
Yeah, to me, it's incredibly consequential. And I hope that when people listen to this podcast, they will understand how consequential it absolutely is. So for me, choosing that date was a no-brainer. Like that is the point at which the reckoning would have to occur, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he absolutely could have chosen not to issue that executive order. He could have gone on and hopefully done nothing to the Japanese Americans. Hopefully he would have just left them alone. But he chose to make this one decision that caused a domino that he absolutely knew would happen, that caused nearly 150,000 lives to be irreparably damaged. So the reckoning has to start with the point at which the irreversible decision was made. And so I think there was no other date I could have launched it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you open season 1 with the infamous George Takei, who played Sulu in the original Star Trek.
I like
that. Sharing his family story before sort of diving into, more kind of traditional guests like historians and scholars. So first question is, how did you land that interview? And second, what was sort of your thinking behind kind of leading with a personal, first person account, more of an emotional story rather than anything else?
Well, nail on the head right there, Sebastian, the emotional story. So one of the through lines I want through this series is for people to not think of it as history a la a textbook. This is a series of dates and events that I read on a page. But this is a series of things that happen to people. And hopefully, as they get to know this community through this history, they get to say, this is a series of things that happened to my friends. And if we can get to that point where everyone feels like my friends were harmed, I couldn't allow this to happen to them, extend that to I couldn't allow this to happen to anyone else. That's the ultimate mission of the podcast, let's say. But starting with that personal story, that's another thing. It felt like a no-brainer to me. framing history through this happened to me. So this isn't history. This is someone telling you their story.
Yeah.
Which everyone telling you their story, that's a version of history. But if we can frame it in a way where it's like, no, my friend had this horrible experience and I get to look in his eyes, I get to feel the feelings that he feels as he tells it. A really good framing for the rest of it because I have plenty of history to cover. This is going to be going on for a very long season. But I want people to start with the feeling of this happened to real people. This happened to my friend.
And you've also, the way you've structured the podcast so far is you've built in these shorter addenda episodes as well that are, I guess, kind of in between your main interviews. I haven't seen many podcasts, history podcasts at least, do this sort of structure. So I'm curious where that idea came from and sort of how has your audience responded to that so far?
Yeah, I guess I'd push back that a lot of history podcasts and a lot of history media, YouTube, whatever, creators will do addenda episodes, but typically it's restricted content. So they'll have it on their Patreon. They'll have it in a place where most people can't see it. And they'll do the same thing that I'm doing in a lot of cases where they'll answer questions. Like, so as I am doing this podcast, there's a lot of things that my guests are speaking from their experience and from their viewpoint. And sometimes our listeners don't have the same viewpoint or experience. So naturally, they're going to have questions. I'm answering those. But also, I feel like it's this really fun way to plug in extra history gaps as well. So both factually, but also to get more of the emotional appeals out. So like, for instance, the one I just released, this morning, midnight this morning, is I just had an episode where this amazing activist and filmmaker, Claudia Katiyanagi, just came on and told us about the Department of Justice camps, but also the fact that during World War II, America paid South and Central American countries to haul away their Japanese citizens and bring them to the continental United States, where we incarcerated them sometimes until 1947.
Right.
It's just crazy. And so after that episode, I was like, I have to find someone's first-person account of this because all the research I'd done, I'd heard about it, but particularly they were stuck there until 1947 fact I'd never heard. And so I went to the National Japanese American Historical Society, and they had some of these oral histories, which means they interviewed people that were there, that lived through it. And I found one that was perfect because it was in English. Remind you that these people were hauled away from South and Central America. Most of them spoke Spanish. But this woman did speak English, and so I got permission to just share her story as she told it. So you get the facts of the story from Claudia Katiyanagi, who did such an incredible job, and then you get the personal story right after it. So you have all of the context that the emotional punch can really land.
Now, speaking of one of these addenda episodes, the one that sort of caught my attention was the one about the Japanese American Citizens League and their sort of controversial policy of cooperation with the government.
Right.
And that really caught my attention because I've read a lot of history books about World War II, and as you read the accounts of, many of the people that were victims, especially the Jewish population, the one sort of consistent story that I see or have seen is that there's this common sense of a lot of the Jewish population were not really all that surprised that the state, the government, turned on them.
Sure.
But what really surprised them was that their neighbors did. People they had known their whole lives, people that they thought would never allow such a thing to happen, people they thought would protect them. And so I'm curious how you sort of handle that sort of morally complicated, piece of history, where, the bad guys aren't just necessarily the government and the state, but, maybe members of the community itself.
Sure. I guess one little piece of pushback I'd put on that is the government could have changed their minds. The decision makers was a very small circle of people. So even though the neighbors weren't necessarily helping and raising up arms like you wish they would have happened in a children's story, honestly, you only had to change 4 people's minds, and this never happened.
Right.
So I would say that it's not necessarily true of the Nazi Party, I'll be fair, but
sure,
at least in this case, if Franklin Roosevelt had not signed that order, it doesn't happen. But yeah, to your point, there are so many stories of the way that the Japanese Americans had already been mistreated when they came to America. I had an interview with a scholar named Susan Kamei, who when she came on detailed the whole history leading up to Pearl Harbor. So this is all of the things that the Japanese Americans experienced. And it's very clear, the majority of the populace in California, at least, was totally on board with these people can't own land. They can't become citizens. If they ever do get any economic gains, we're going to do everything we can to put them in their place, so to speak. But then even after Pearl Harbor happened, I had Emily Inouye Huey, who is an author, come on. She's run amazing work, highly recommend. She came on and had a family story of where I believe it was her great uncle was taken away by the FBI directly after Pearl Harbor occurred. And her neighbors, his neighbors, chose to go to the police station and make an appeal for this man. They said, he's our friend. We know him. He's not dangerous. And the FBI let him go. Which is to say, it did happen. It was very, very rare. And it can happen. So that's inspiring for us today. But to your point, the community let this happen. There could have been every person in that community that knew a Japanese American could have walked down to the police station. They could have made that same appeal.
Yeah.
And that probably would have at least dramatically altered the effect of the incarceration, if not the facts of it.
I've also seen you say that you've probably got at least a dozen seasons worth of sort of uncomfortable American history to cover.
That's just the American, you're right.
Without giving sort of too much away, I'm curious, what themes or sort of through lines you're hoping will connect, the seasons and the stories that you want to tell. Is there sort of a common theme that you want to kind of circle around?
Sure. Sebastian, knocking it out the park again. Look at you. So definitely, I was looking for stories that were just of something that was awful that happened and start there because there's plenty of that material. But it's amazing how, as you point out, what's the through line? Because the through line came upon me on its own. It really is. The story is the same almost every time of the ones that I've been looking at. The majority group did not care that the minority group was suffering. And it's almost as simple as that. And you can find that in every culture, in every country.
Yeah.
But particularly to American history, we profess to be this democratic nation where we're totally able to stand up for minority rights. We have every right assured in the law, the Constitution. And yet there have been hundreds and thousands of episodes where that was not lived up to, where the majority chose to actively participate in allowing something to happen, or usually they just went about their business and let the smaller group suffer. And so I'm sure our listeners are already thinking of at least a dozen situations that applies to in American history. And so I'm following those threads.
Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit and I know your podcast is pretty new, but I do want to get into a little bit of what you're sort of doing to try and grow the show and what you've done so far. So again, given the fact that it's only a few months old, how did you go about getting some of your first listeners and what's actually been working for you in terms of getting the word out there?
Oh, sure. Well, I don't know if anything's working for me. That's the funny thing about being a new podcaster is there's no bar. I have no expectations. I don't know how many listeners is a good number of listeners, and that's very freeing. So I will try to maintain that ignorance as long as possible. But let's see. First listeners, I should mention, big thank you to the people who chose to listen to my episodes. I had beta listeners. I had people go through it and just say, this was confusing, this story went on too long, that kind of thing. And so I was able to cut down. And those ones were just begging my friends. Every podcaster has been there, I'm sure. But as far as actually, upon release, getting listeners, the biggest thing was that I knew, 2 steps back. I knew that I was going to need help because I am not a marketer. I am a writer. On a good day, I can call myself an artist. And on a better day, I can call myself an armchair historian. So I'm using only those skills because I know that other people have the skills I lack. So in order to launch this podcast knowing I would need help and that help would cost money, I chose to partner with organizations that would make donations. So I partnered with the Japanese American Citizens League it's located in Salt Lake City, but it's called the Untitled Chapter, where I'm also a board member. And so through their nonprofit status, so technically they're the ones sponsoring this season of the podcast, they were able to apply for grants. And those grants came from bodies that were interested in Japanese American history or history in general. And through that, I was able to get enough funding to then hire a publicist. And that publicist is the one who's actually making anything happen. So huge shout out to Ariel Nasenblatt. She's been just doing an amazing job. Shout out to her because she's doing everything that I couldn't possibly do. I do not have the skill set. I think it's important to acknowledge where you just don't have the ability. So why would you do it?
Yeah, she's awesome. I've had her on my show. She was actually the first guest on this show.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, so yeah, that was actually going to lead me to my next question about how you managed to land those sponsorships, but you already explained that. So I want to ask you about sort of the main theme I feel like of your podcast is, here's history that is going to make you a little bit uncomfortable. And I feel like that's a bit of a harder sell than, maybe a podcast that's professing to just entertain you. So how do you sort of promote a show, do you think, that asks people to sort of sit with some of these difficult truths without maybe scaring them off?
Sure. Oh, good question, Sebastian. Again, let's see. I guess to answer first, like selling it, thank goodness I do not have any predilections that I'm selling anything because I'm not making any money off of this. I just want people to learn this history. And so thank goodness I have no stake in it being sold in that sense, but I do have a stake in people learning history and gaining empathy. So in that sense, yes, I'm absolutely selling something. I really want people to take it. I don't know, it's interesting. I just found that people want to know more about something they don't know about, like just basic human curiosity. So like the hurdle of this is going to make me uncomfortable just has not been the hurdle. I guess sidebar there though, there are people who are deeply invested in the telling of this history that have no obvious connection to it. So for example, I'm putting out clips of this podcast. It's going on to TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all of that.
Yeah.
And on YouTube, the algorithm has tended toward who's going to be really angry at this clip. And so I've gotten feedback in the comments. It's not feedback, it's just comments. But comments that are in the language of like Holocaust denial, where it's like whataboutism and this was not as nearly like arguing about facts, but the facts are not disregarding the main whole. Anyway, where people are like trying to split hairs, but the hairs are so far away from the main head. That metaphor is not working for me. But anyway, there are people who deeply care about it, but I'm never going to convince them. Like, why would they spend 16 hours listening to my podcast? They're never going to. So I'm not trying to. I'm not worried about it. What I love to see are comments that say, I did not know that, and I'd like to learn more. No one's had that exact wording. So big kudos to the first one who does. But I guess on tandem there too, like now it's going on TikTok, and the TikTok algorithm seems to be like, who's going to agree with this the most? Because the comments there are like, oh, you're right. That was horrible. I'm so sorry that happened. And that's a positive reaction. I welcome it. I love that they watched it. I'd love even more if they said that and then said, now I'm going to listen to it because I feel like there's more I could learn here.
Mm-hmm.
I want that middle ground, but unfortunately, the algorithms that rule us do not favor the middle ground. They don't want people who are just somewhat interested and have something to learn. Anyway, I lost what your question was in the beginning. So if you'd get me back on track.
No, that's actually quite interesting that you've detected this sort of very detectable split between how the algorithms are sort of, or who the algorithms on these various platforms are pushing your clips to.
Yeah.
You've also got a Substack newsletter, is that right?
I do. I'm not very good at it. I'm very sorry about that, but please read it.
What was the thinking behind starting that as well, alongside the podcast?
Oh, it's just that. So the biggest thing there is that Substack is just stickier than podcast platforms because now I would have access to the email list and things like that. So if people are, and also it's just an indication of how, because it's sticky, it's an indication of how stuck someone is. That's not a great metaphor either. But anyway, if someone does reach out through the Substack, that means they're there for the whole ride. Like they're going to be listening through to the end of this podcast. And so it's a really great way to give people something tangible that they can do to feel like they're part of a community and part of something that's growing and developing.
Yeah. I'm a huge history fan. I listen to a lot of history podcasts, but there are a lot of them. It's a very crowded field, at least it feels like to me. How do you think about that? Sort of entering this sort of a crowded field. How do you hope History for the Reckoning will stand out?
Interesting question, Sebastian. So as I mentioned before, I'm not trying to sell this. I'm not making money. And so I'm not in competition in the sense of I want to do better than anyone else. I want every ship to rise. I want this ocean to rise. I want everyone to learn every bit of history. That'd be great.
Sure.
But in the sense of like, how do I get this piece of history to be learned? Because I do deeply care that people learn this, like I said, the untold civil rights story of American history. And I mean, I guess I'm really leaning on the publicist to really find that niche, to find that nook, because I'm no marketer, I'm no publicist. But what's really nice about those who listen to history podcasts is they're willing to listen to a lot of them. I know that's just true for me. I have followed at least several dozen podcasts that are history or about uncommon knowledge. And so really, I made the podcast that I would listen to, which is the advice you should give everyone. But it's interesting how the people that are listening to it are following along. Like, it's been remarkably sticky for the numbers of people per episode. Better than projections, like what we would have expected. The numbers are not fantastic. I'm not going to brag about that. But I am very proud that I found people who are interested enough that they want to keep learning. And so I do not know what I ascribe that to other than Ariel and her amazing work. But the fact that people want to learn history is inspiring to me to keep telling it.
That's fantastic. That's a really good early sign and a good indicator that you're doing something right with the show if you have a high percentage of listeners sticking around from episode to episode. Yeah. I want to just touch a little bit more on sort of podcasts and the podcast industry in general. And I think I heard you say somewhere that the reason the Japanese American incarceration was allowed to happen was that, sort of ordinary Americans, they saw them as the enemy instead of, their neighbors. Do you think that podcasting, with its sort of intimate, long-form, voice-driven format, is perhaps uniquely capable of maybe rebuilding some of that, human empathy that we are missing a lot these days? Across some of these divides, whether they're racial or political or whatnot.
Right across the plate, Sebastian. Great question for this particular podcast. Thank you. I absolutely believe that the format that I've chosen is well tuned so that people get this sense of, I am just having a conversation with a friend, because that's exactly what I'm going for. I've said it ad nauseum at this point. Because you'll notice, for all of you who've obviously heard every one of my episodes, when I put out that episode I just referenced, where it's the story of someone who was Japanese Peruvian, was taken away to the United States and was incarcerated here, that one is tightly edited. I took 2 hours of material and bam, I put it into under 20 minutes to just get the highlights, something that really got every shocking point, every emotional appeal. But what I did with all of my interviews was I left them a lot less tightly edited. I wanted you to feel like you were just in the room having this conversation, listening to at least two other people have a conversation. So I left in some of the jagged edges, some of the ums, and some of the idiosyncrasies that made my guests not just an expert, but a person who was conveying this information. I really feel like you're just what you said. Podcasts, people listen to them in headphones, they listen to them in their cars. It's this incredibly intimate experience, the way that we don't watch movies, we don't watch TV shows. We don't even listen to music in the same way, the same amount of attachment to it. I mean, someone's going to argue with me about that. But anyway, when I go and watch a band on stage, I'm watching a band on stage. When I'm listening to a conversation between two friends, I feel like I'm much closer to it. And I really want the podcast to give that feeling, so that as people listen to it directly into their brain with these headphones, they feel like they're just sitting across the table from the two of us as I'm learning a piece of history and they're learning it with me.
Now, you had a guest on that was incarcerated in Arizona during World War II. And obviously, a lot of those people are getting quite old. And that generation of people with firsthand memory of events like this is disappearing. So do you feel like podcasting has sort of a special role to play in archiving some of this history, in having some of this testimony that perhaps otherwise would be lost? And does that sort of create a bit of a sense of urgency in you to kind of get going with making the show?
That's interesting. Archiving, 100% no. Podcasting, you could though. I do not doubt the ability of a podcast to absolutely publish oral histories and to get people to tell their stories. It wouldn't have a lot of followers, and that's fine. You could still do it. So I want to shout out the people that are doing that work, because that work is absolutely being done. So places like denshow.org, where there are hundreds and hundreds of oral histories, people that have chosen in the 1950s and beyond to take tape recorders and to sit down with these people, usually in usually it's in like a setting where there's like a pilgrimage is already happening and these people are just like going into a room and just recording interview after interview, and it's grueling work. And I really want to shout out to them because I am not doing what I would describe as grueling work, but people like densho.org, and I mentioned the National Japanese American Historical Society has many oral interviews. I know that here in Salt Lake, there was just a grant awarded to the Salt Lake chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League that are going to be doing oral histories with, I believe, youth and queer Japanese Americans. So the work goes on, and I do not think that my little podcast is moving the needle on that one, but I do think it's moving the needle on that introductory step of people learning this history. Oh my goodness, I'd love to get an email someday. Someone said, I learned the history, I had no family connection to it, and I chose to go to a pilgrimage because of it.
Yeah.
I chose to attend a Japanese American Citizens League meeting event, go to Nihon Matsuri or Obon or one of these Japanese community things. Because, yeah, I am not archiving history here in the sense of I am getting all of the facts down. But what I am doing is giving just a peek behind this curtain that was always there. People could have looked at it the whole time. But hopefully in this format that people accept. And so through that, making a friend intimacy, they feel like, wow, I've engaged with this community already. I'm half a step in. I can start to really make a friend here in a much more literal way.
Going back to what you said earlier about, getting certain types of feedback that perhaps feels a bit combative. I'm wondering, obviously, I don't know about how you feel about this, but I feel like we're living in a moment where history itself is being sort of contested on the internet in various places. We've got certain governments trying to enact book bans. We've got fights about curriculum, debates about all kinds of history.
Yeah.
Does this sort of political climate make a show like yours maybe more necessary? Or does it actually make the work harder because you've got audiences that are clearly very polarized, and maybe that sort of uncomfortable history kind of triggers a defensiveness, without them maybe even hitting play on your podcast?
Sure. So, yeah, just like as a look into that question, I'm going to tell a story that maybe won't feel related at the beginning, but I chose to use the word concentration camps every time I'm referencing where these people were incarcerated during World War II. Both because it's literally accurate, like they were concentrating people, and that's the language that was used in government memos, things like that. So it's not inaccurate to say at all. But also, I like that people will be made uncomfortable and perhaps even shocked by that. I want people, because as we all know, if you hear concentration camp, you immediately think Dachau, Auschwitz-Birkenau. You are thinking of the death camps that the Nazis made. And that is incomparable in scope, absolutely. But I do want people to have that knee jerk of like, oh, concentration camp means something unacceptably horrible happened. Because I absolutely want them to think that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I'm willing to lean into the polarization of certain words in order to communicate this was unacceptable. I don't care what your political background is. This shouldn't happen. You can fight about where the stoplight should go in your neighborhood without locking anyone in a concentration camp.
Yeah.
But following that up, I do want, beyond that very obvious way I'm leaning into loaded words, I hope that people take it as a history show and not as a message show. Because like I've said, the message is, I am now a friend of this community. And the message is, I feel like I'm tied enough to them that I can be part and parcel with their experience. And therefore, I would not allow this kind of thing to happen. They can use whatever political mechanism they want to make sure it doesn't happen. I'll be very happy if it never happens again. But I do want people to feel like this is apolitical to the extent of these are the facts as they happened. As you mentioned, I had Chizu Mori on. She can say, I was there. This is what happened. I was locked in Poston, Arizona for years. I lost the middle of my teenage years. And now when I got home, I had lost so many things. My family had lost so many things. And I want people, I don't know, there's just that, you've maybe heard of the friendship can break down a lot of differences. If you really feel like I care about this community, we can disagree to a very large degree and still make meaningful, good things happen. And so I'm hoping that people that are interested in history, regardless of what their politics are, will listen to it. I'm also hoping that once they do, they'll use whatever their politics are to make good things happen afterward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're very right about the friendship bit in particular. Often you hear people be very rigid about some of their views and fall hard on one side, but sometimes all it takes is either a family member or a friend to be affected by, whatever that issue is or policy is, for them to start to clue in or to rethink how they view that particular issue. But it needs to be personal. It needs to be, something that is directly in their life, which I don't know what that says about people. Sometimes I feel like, okay, that's great it's great that at least something can get through, but man, have some empathy beyond your own borders, right?
That's
beyond
true.
your
So
own
if I could
home.
circle back on something that you said, you mentioned how you have not been to the labor camps and the death camps that the Nazis employed during World War II. But what does it mean to you that those sites exist and that, so you said, I am Polish, and then you said that. So clearly the personal connection is through the family history. What do you feel like that means to you now, 80 years on?
Well, I think there's no question that, being Polish, being born there, having heard that history directly from, my grandparents to some extent. And, there's no question that in some way that sparked my interest in history, particularly of that time. But I don't know, I feel some sort of personal connection to it, but I haven't quite reckoned what that connection is yet.
Interesting.
I think my interest in history around that time, I've probably read hundreds of World War II history books at this point, and I feel like I have a, decent grasp on it, but there's still things that surprise me from time to time. And so I'm still grappling with exactly what that connection means for me.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to talk to you again if you're able to take a trip to Poland and see the things that would be meaningful to at least to your family, if not to the whole Polish people. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping to go there probably within the next few years and bring my daughter there too, so she can see as well.
That'd be great. All right, report back.
I will. Okay, so I don't know if you're ready to talk about this yet, because obviously you're still in the middle of this first season, but have you settled on sort of what your next seasons will focus on yet?
Like I said, I've got dozens of concepts, but I'm currently researching the way that chattel slavery was handled in the northern states. Because I remember I was reading a book on Civil War history, because just like you, I'm constantly reading something. And it mentioned, what was it? Okay, before the Battle of Antietam, so this is 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee has gone up all the way up into near Baltimore, and now they're headed west past Fredericksburg. None of this is important. Anyway, as they were moving, they were trying to recruit local farmers because they knew that that was a heavily slave-holding county. So in the area around Antietam, there were famously, there's some, they call them the Dunkers, a religious sect that was anti-slavery, was in fact abolitionist, but there were many Marylanders that were still holding slaves. And so I was like, wait just a dang second. 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation is literally a week from being announced. And Maryland, a northern state, still has slaves. And so that's another one where it's that's so crazy. I got to look more into this. And you better believe that rabbit hole keeps going. So I am excited to tell that story too.
Fascinating. Yeah, I look forward to that. I'll definitely stay tuned into your show.
Thank you.
Okay, final two questions, Spencer. First, what are 3 podcasts that you'd recommend?
Well, as concerns the history of Japanese American incarceration, I can absolutely recommend those. So Burn Order is a very tightly MSNBC just produced. So that's the easiest way to jump in, particularly if you feel politically aligned with MSNBC. And if you don't, maybe don't listen to that one. Then there's one by densho.org that's called Kampu. That's about what was the life inside of these concentration camps. So my podcast, I chose not to dig very deep into that because it's been covered very well in other podcasts. And so Kampu there, and then also Look to the Mountain, which is about specifically Heart Mountain, Wyoming, one of the concentration camps during World War II. So I'd recommend those, but I can go beyond that. I really love You're Wrong About. That's Sarah Marshall. That's one, every episode is something that you haven't heard before, and it's a new piece of history or a new piece of culture. I love challenging your assumptions. And so I'm not very good at when I'm challenged directly, but I like to sit on the side and have little bits of me challenged. And Sarah Marshall does a great job there. Omnibus, I think it's called Omnibus Project. Anyway, that one's just kind of the same vein where we're like, I love a podcast that will take me into a brand new piece of culture or history and tell me something that I didn't know before. Because now that I've done this with hundreds and hundreds of episodes from these podcasts, the web has started to connect in a way that's really satisfying to me. And that you can see the human experience has been cyclical and we all have the same inclinations. And it's kind of the story of my podcast too, that the patterns are there. And if we just learn them, we can undo them.
I love Omnibus. I'm a huge fan of John Roderick.
Oh, heck yeah.
And finally, where can people find you online?
So look up History for the Reckoning on all of your social media. So Instagram particularly, follow me there because that's where I actually check the messages. But if you're on TikTok too, by all means, and follow History for the Reckoning on all your podcast platforms.
Spencer, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.